Okay. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Kids Media Club podcast. I'm Andy Williams.
I'm Emily Horgan.
And I'm Jo Redfern. And we have a special episode today. Thank you very much to those listeners who sent in questions. So we have about half a dozen to get through today. We'll try and get through as many as possible. But it was really great to get some suggestions from listeners. So we'll crack straight on. The first one from Rob Doherty himself. Got a competitive podcast in this space, but we like to think that we're frenemies, shall we say. His question was, what do you think the children's media landscape will look like in 5 years' time? What a one to kick off with. Emily, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, future gazing. Well, you know my position, which I think is also your position, Jo, is the streaming race is over. YouTube has won. So I think in 5 years' time, we're going to see a continuation of that. I can't imagine that there's going to be anything major to disrupt it, particularly given we have seen the emergence of another video platform come in, TikTok, and YouTube has retained a massive share of market. As producers are putting more and more content on there, I'm interested to see how that shapes the landscape, shapes the commissioning landscape. It's a tricky one. I have trepidation, I have to say. I do have concern about it's a vicious circle. The need to have content on YouTube if you want to be valid and want to be relevant to the kids audience, which is on YouTube en masse, versus the paywall, the need to paying for content, the kind of some of the devaluation of kids content because it's available for free on that platform. I have trepidation about that. I'm not saying it's unsolvable. I believe that it is, but I think YouTube will just continue to be and solidify as a major streaming platform. I do think there'll be consolidation of the other smaller streaming platforms. Netflix is definitely here to stay. Disney Plus, I can't imagine will fold, but I think beyond that, there will be mergers, acquisitions, conclusions, etc. So I think that is bound to happen in the next 5 years. And I would say, yeah, by 5 years' time, that we will definitely have seen that.
It's just jumping in. It's difficult I would concur wholeheartedly, difficult to argue against it when we see the tide of behaviors with young people and how they go to YouTube first. It's their prime platform that they go to for video content. And with that brings a whole heap of considerations in terms of they don't see the point in subscribing. They're serial churners. Those are habits that are being formed and are solidifying now. So in 5 years' time are only going to be more pronounced. As you say, a lot of the smaller streamers will fail or will be rolled up. But, we've also got a generation of young people who across gaming as well are used to microtransacting. So there's no reason to think that they wouldn't do that for content too. We're talking about the devaluation of content because they mainly consume it for free. But I would imagine that we'll get to the stage where actually some content they will pay for and be willing to pay for. Even on YouTube, you can buy premium content on YouTube. So this move to kind of individual and micro transacting, I think, is going to be an interesting thing that we'll be seeing.
Ooh, yeah, that's a bit of hope there, Jo. That's a chink of hope. What do you think, Andy?
My sense is that there's going to be two trends, really. And one is that for big brands, you're going to have big I think there was a period where brands like Disney and some of the big brands would try and do some slightly edgier content. And I think those days have passed for the big brands. And I think now they're going to definitely go for something that has broad mainstream appeal, and they're going to avoid kind of areas that might be divisive, because I think they want to appeal to as big an audience as possible. So I think that trend's going to definitely continue. And I think those big brands are going to leverage the money and the power that they have to kind of do big, kind of splashy, popular entertainment. And then
when you say edgy content, what are you thinking there? What are you thinking?
So I think in America, I think there's probably a sense that they're going to avoid upsetting either side of the political divide. And so there's some areas that I think previously Disney would have been kind of happy to venture into. And I think now, because budgets are tighter and they need more revenue, I think they're going to shift away from getting involved in any of those. It's kind of spats, really, is
Mm.
my sense. So that's kind of more for the movies, really, than anything. But it might have an impact on bigger budget series. I think there's going to be a lot of niche, quite focused, almost kind of micro content that's going to be able to explore areas that the bigger brands are going to sort of shy away from. Some of that might be in terms of, I think that one of the mind shifts that people, I think, are going to have over the next 5 years or so is to almost kind of, as a creator, is to think past platforms and broadcast channels and think about what audience you're communicating to. And I think there's been a tendency to almost think of audiences as equivalent to the channels. So we've had a tendency to think of a BBC children's audience or a Disney children's audience. And I think that doesn't really hold water anymore, that way of analysing our audience. And it's more about looking at what specific audiences define themselves by in terms of their interests. So I think, there might be an opportunity for creators to make content to serve fans of women's football, young fans of women's football. That's quite a niche audience, and they might feel like they're underserved in terms of content created for children. But there's an opportunity there. It might not have lots of revenue attached to it that would attract maybe the biggest brands at this point. But there is definitely an opportunity for smaller creators to get in there and put a kind of placeholder down on that content. So I think there's going to be, it's going to split really between the bigger brands having kind of broad kind of mass appeal, and then that allowing an opportunity for people to kind of follow where specific audiences' interests are.
It's interesting, isn't it? Given that YouTube, with its 110 million channels, is it? That is the perfect place for niche and serving niche. I mean, you look at chess.com and the chess.com YouTube channel, that's having a huge moment. So I heard the term.
You look at the chess.com YouTube channel, Joe?
I have 2 children who are obsessed with this. Kick my butt every time we play chess now.
Amazing.
Yeah, I mean, but then they go and play, and then they go and find some adjacent content on YouTube. To your point, Andy, we know, and we've said this for a long time, how young people are platform agnostic. So if they find their niche, their thing, they want to surround themselves with it on whatever platform they happen to be on at the time, or
Absolutely.
platforms. I heard this term recently, and I really love it, and I must look up who said it and maybe define it a little bit more, but it was digital campfires, how young people find themselves around digital campfires. And that in itself kind of takes you away from, it doesn't matter what platform they're on. If they're sat around a digital campfire, they're consuming content, wherever. And I think that's really, really interesting, because it flips on its head that, the channel and method of delivery kind of silos that we've all grown up in and spent a greater part of our career in. But now it's completely flipped on its head, and we have to start thinking about servicing the audience where they are with content that they want, while, in the need state that they're in on that particular platform, which we know is very different between TikTok, between Roblox, between YouTube, between SVOD consumption, and think about it that way. It's a whole different shift and skill set, isn't it?
It is. And a real shift in mindset as well, in terms of how you think about creating or commissioning content, I think.
Digital campfires, that's kind of like a warm takeaway.
Yeah.
I like that, yeah.
Look up who said it whilst we carry on.
That gives me hope. Okay, so the next question is from Emily Lemerle, and is, what is the podcast landscape like for kids? We know they're across Roblox and YouTube. Is there movement in the podcast space too? So the podcast space is something I've been looking at more recently, and I think is a really under-tapped, fertile ground for content, I think, and audiences to a certain extent. I think, there's obviously there've been attempts to kind of take a big swing at the podcast space through services like Pinna, services like Wondery, which is an Amazon podcast app. And it feels like no one's really unlocked it for kids completely, I would say. When we look at the phenomenon that's happened on adult podcasts, I feel like we're kind of coming through to the second wave of a massive uptick of podcasts. Obviously, there was amazing narrative podcasts and true crime, a genre that was huge. And what we can see from the TV world is like, you can see that the fertility of podcasting as a great space for mining stories and ideas. And we've seen numerous podcast adaptations happen on the adult side. So I think I don't think the big swing has necessarily been gotten right in the podcast space, but there are some people doing some really good stuff. There's the Story Pirates podcast, a small word order based in the UK, do some great podcasts. And the other thing I think that is really interesting in the kids' audio space is services like Tony's and Yoto Box. So like those kind of, because that's something that's an issue, right? Is that like kids having mastery over their own music and audio consumption is something that's been a bit lost, you know? I used to record songs off the radio that I liked onto a mixtape, right? I used to make radio shows with my kids, like with my mates as a kid. I don't know if you guys did that.
Yeah.
The first iteration of the Kids Media Club podcast. But like that kind of play is kind of lost a little bit. And audio is such a great space from a well-being point of view. You know, like it's a screen-free environment. It's very easy to digest amongst many other people, like, you know, as a family or in a car journey and all that kind of stuff. So I think podcasting is fertile, undertapped, and underleveraged. I think if somebody was able to get it right in terms of a business model, that, you know, because I you know, there's some companies fighting the good fight and like doing well and keeping above board, but there's not like a real breakout hit where we can go, that part of the industry is like completely safe and buoyant for the rest of its life. Yeah, so I think there's some really great opportunities. There's some really great opportunities in podcasting. And also I think this point that we're hearing from commissioners about, you know, proven IP, you know, and I think podcasting is a great place to prove an IP potentially before taking it elsewhere, being able to prove it from a creativity point of view, to say like, these are the stories, these are the characters, look, this is how we can prove it hangs together. And then also from an audience point of view. So that's my rant on podcasts.
Sorry, Andy.
I was just going, well, just one question was, does the podcast landscape for kids mirror the landscape for children's media in other areas? So is there a kind of preschool podcast category, and how does that then age up beyond that?
I think it's not developed enough. I think there's a few small people in the space, as I said, fighting the good fight and doing great work, but it's not blown up. When we think about podcasting for adults and how big that is, I mean, over here in Ireland, the RTE2, like the young people's radio station, has just literally hemorrhaged like a whole ton of presenters, right, who are all going to podcasting for that's many long stories behind each of them. But you know, we see like podcasts blowing up, like My Therapist Ghosts Me, the Luana podcast. The rest is everything. The rest is politics. The rest is entertainment. The sports podcasts are huge. You know, there's the Peter Crouch, which can't remember the name of the Peter Crouch one. That's big. Like, there's so much variety, and I feel like is it just called that? Okay, straightforward. But there's just so much. There's so much variety. There's so much richness, and I feel like there has to be some of that for kids. One of the issues is delivery, right? Like a parent isn't going to leave their phone with their kid to listen to a podcast, and I think that's where audio.
That's what I was going to say. I think the delivery mechanism is a real issue, isn't it? Because podcasting is a very personal experience, and grown-ups tend to do it through their own personal device, and we don't tend to have that kind of radio or hi-fi in the family room anymore. That's how I listen to radio.
Do you remember the Fisher Price one? I had the Fisher Price one, which was like sandy. It was a sandy color with red buttons, and I was able to record. Like, it was huge. I might post an image of it. Like,
remember? I had the silver, the kind of ghetto blaster where I used to record the charts on a Sunday. But you know, we don't tend to have those in the house anymore.
Yeah.
Literally, when I was growing up, the radio was always on from day till night. It was there, just playing away in the kitchen. You know, audio was just a part of your life, whereas we seem to have lost that, particularly for kids. And I think then when audio was embraced, I think with Alexa, it almost just became the replacement for reading stories at bedtime. You know, you could have the Alexa read a story for you, which was quite a prescriptive, literal way of using audio. Whereas the grown-up podcasting space has gone off and been creative. You know, you've got the Infinite Monkey Cage, you've got some really interesting podcasts, but tended to have just reverted to bedtime storytelling for younger younger audiences.
Mm.
So I think to your point about it being kind of under-leveraged, I think that's right. I mean, there's a few really good ones that you've already mentioned. Is it Wow in the World I listened to? And there was a great history one called You're Dead to Me, which was really funny. Yeah, I think kudos to those that are fighting the good fight and trying to carve something really interesting and novel in that young podcasting space. And
Is
then
the, sorry, I was going to say, is the You're Dead to Me, is that a spin-off of Horrible Histories?
I think it might be, or it's in that vein. It's been a
Right.
while since I looked at it, but and I listened probably a couple of years ago, but it was really good, really well put together, informative and funny.
Hmm.
But I do wonder also, because kids are so visual that
Yeah.
actually, I certainly my own two, if they're sat gaming on their gaming consoles, they are listening to something, but it's a video on YouTube that's also playing on their phone propped up against the console. So that's almost their equivalent of audio, but it's a YouTube video.
Interesting. And there aren't any podcasts that really cater to that audience of gamers then, particularly?
I don't know. There probably are,
Ooh.
but there's many more YouTubers that fulfill that same.
Going back to the kind of following the audience rather than the platform, it feels like that again is kind of one where there's definitely a kind of a powerful audience there to serve.
Yeah, because very often, the YouTubers that they're listening to whilst playing on their consoles are the gamers that are talking about a playthrough of the same game or a breakdown of said game and its lore or whatever. So, but they're just not watching it, but they are listening.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely opportunity there, and Buster Trust is another one I would reference as a good example of a kids podcast. But it's just, I don't know, is it the physicality? Because it is a personal experience as well. There needs to be, I feel like when you're listening to audio, you need to have autonomy in it, right? You need to go, I like that song, or I like that podcast, I'm going to put it on now. Like as opposed to like the gate-kept situation with the parent owning having the digital device. So yeah, no, I do feel like that there has to be something that can be unlocked there for sure.
And podcasts tend to also be, I think, for adults, there's something that obviously you can listen to a podcast and you can do something else at the same time. So I'll often listen to a podcast when I'm on a run or driving or something like that, and it's to work out what's the equivalent of that for a younger audience in terms of something where they can be doing one activity but also listening to a podcast at the same time. Yeah, interesting.
I wonder if TikTok could be, I mean, given that TikTok is such a powerful discovery mechanism for music, and a lot of Spotify playlists are constructed just off songs that have been discovered on TikTok. Wonder if there's potential there to do the same for podcasts.
Yeah, YouTube constantly talk about getting into the podcast game too, but
it's not quite worked though, has it?
I know they're still talking about it though. I don't. But then it just.
Yeah,
interesting.
Talk. Is that what it would be called? The podcast talk or
pod talk?
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like maybe we should look into doing an episode about podcasts, about kids podcasting altogether, and get a little bit more informed about it, because it's a really interesting space.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Next question is from Jay Stansfield. How do you feel about creators using AI to produce children's content?
I think you need to kick off this one, Andy.
Yeah.
I'm inviting you.
Okay, so I think there's a couple of things that certainly the legal copyright issue is something that people are still wrestling with. And I think if you're looking to monetize it, it might be something to just keep an eye on. I think in terms of idea generation or brainstorming, I think it's a great tool for that. It kind of ultimately depends on what you're using it for. I mean, I think the copyright thing is something where it's important to be mindful of that. And I know there's a lot of creators that are very keen on exploiting AI, but are still a bit wary about where the copyright issue sits, where everything, because it does hamper your ability to potentially monetize it if it is an issue.
Yeah. And how do we feel about how it could potentially evolve jobs, in the sense that, storyboarding could largely be done by AI, but that takes a layer of work out of the process. So, is it the same as, any new technology makes puts some people out of work, but then creates new jobs?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not quite sure how many new jobs it will create. I sometimes think the prompt engineer aspect of it is a bit overhyped. I think where it will have kind of a lot of application is if you're a creator or a producer, you can use AI to do something that you might have hired somebody else to do. I don't think you're not going to hire a prompt engineer to do something that you'd have hired a storyboard artist to do, because that would just be potentially costing you money. So its utility comes in sort of replacing some work that you'd have to pay for. That's how it becomes more. That's why it becomes a business opportunity, really. I think there's definitely areas where I think it will have kind of enormous sort of potential. Sometimes I had an interesting conversation with a writer producer who was very kind of keen on using for storyboarding and other areas, but said, but I'd never use it for scripting. And I kind of got it, but I also feel like there's an element where everyone's protective about AI intruding onto the bit that they do, but are more relaxed about AI doing the stuff they don't do. Which is kind of human nature.
And there's also there's that accessibility piece, that it opens up creativity and execution to people who don't have expertise in certain things, and that's something that, like, again, people are really struggling with is, how do I get onto YouTube? Like how do I have an idea for something, how do I execute it? How do I get it off the ground? And that's the benefit that AI can offer. And I guess their opportunity comes with more people being able to put their hand in and have success in creative industries, for sure. I mean, I think it's use it definitely in terms of idea generation and being able to, like, draw on the whiteboard, but doing it in a really meaningful way that people can react to and really build on is phenomenal. I think the concern then is AI generated equals low quality. That's the concern, that it all gets genericized, homogenized, and the content that's being outputted for kids just basically sucks and it's garbage. Now, I think you made this point, Joe, recently about what does quality mean, and I think the question of what quality means is changing, and quality doesn't necessarily equal premium. And so having a bit of a rougher thing, and this is, YouTube has been doing this for 20 years, like having a rougher mock-up of an idea or a concept. In Ireland, we had a show go viral called Martin's Life, an animated show that's super simple, super rough. It's all in the scripting. It's kind of really twee and funny, but it's trying to, like, YouTube has been doing rough for ages, and that doesn't mean it's definitely connected with audiences. So anyone who's going to say, oh, it's not good quality, just means it's not premium. There's still storytelling, there's still characterization, there's still lots going on for that content. So
to your point, lowering the barriers to creativity and allowing people to get on those platforms is, to some extent, yes, it opens the floodgates, but again, it also allows those little nuggets to rise and shine when they wouldn't necessarily have had chance to before. And again, you just mentioned YouTube. I'm coming back to Roblox. It's a low code platform. They just announced this weekend at the Roblox Developers Conference that they're rolling out a bigger suite of AI tools, which again allows a lot of young people turn their hobby into a business. And actually, Roblox is paying salaries for a lot of young people who to that point would never have got near game development. And they're testing, learning, failing, iterating, and creating good games. Yes, the tolerance for what we might perceive as quality is different, but it still has to be good. It still has to be compelling. It still has to attract users back. It has to get them to stay there for longer than 20 seconds. And so these games are, they've got average session times of 19, 20 minutes. So, they're learning, and they are learning a craft. It's different to ours, but it's equally valid.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think, going back to YouTube, YouTube in its infancy was, technically it was pretty crude in terms of the videos that were being uploaded. But I think there's an element where, you know, your Mr. Beast, your Sidemen, any of these YouTubers, if you're pumping out content every day and you're filming it all the time, you're getting a lot of hits at bat, and you're going to get better because practice makes perfect. And naturally you'll get to the point where you're doing a lot more practice in your craft than somebody in traditional media will have an opportunity to do. So I definitely think that there's enormous potential for AI to be used for a lot of niche creators, and its application in terms of gaming, I think, is going to be huge. I almost feel like the copyright discussion tends to gravitate around questions around generative AI, whereas we forget that there's an enormous amount of AI that isn't covered by that description.
Yeah, and I think I've mentioned it before. You know, one of the best examples I saw earlier this year at the Game Developers Conference with a startup called Hidden Door, run by a very smart couple who trained. So they were using out of copyright work, so like The Wizard of Oz, but you know, using machine learning and AI to learn the world and learn the words, but, you know, learn responses. So actually you could go in and have a choose your own adventure kind of experience and story within a world that has been trained on that particular book or that text or that group of texts, you know, or Lord of the Rings. And the idea being that it was so smart that actually every interaction you had, every choice that you made, every piece of dialogue that you had, even with an NPC, would be then served back to you in a completely genuine, authentic way that has high fidelity to the world that was in the original works. And I thought that was, you know, such a smart use of AI and machine learning.
What's an NPC, Joe?
Non-playable character.
Okay.
A meme in itself.
Yeah.
But, you know, when, you know, we've all read books and imagined what it'd be like to go and have an adventure in that world. And this is, you know, is where, to your point, Andy, rather than generative AI being a replacement, actually an expansion.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's a really great use of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can totally see how it could be. I was on Duolingo today, and when I was playing it, I was thinking you could very much merge a Dora the Explorer type adventure with Duolingo, and you could be helping Dora kind of complete an adventure, but she could be communicating in another language, and it would be a way in which you combine gameplay with language acquisition. And you can see how AI could be really kind of utilized to create kind of brands and experiences like that. Luckily, I haven't told anyone apart from you guys.
Brilliant. Cool. Well, we're down to, so I've got a question from Mandagus Chokubaitis. It's about having to navigate between YouTube and broadcasters. So we know broadcasters don't want the same content on their TV and on YouTube. That's definitely feedback. You know, producers are dealing with holdbacks, limits, all that kind of stuff, and it's painful. So what is the producer to do? The good thing I like seeing here is inherent. The producer knows that they need to be on YouTube if they want to be a relevant kids brand today. So that's a good start. But what do you do? Do you produce separate content for YouTube? But obviously that's challenging in funding. And I would also argue is an issue if the objective of being on YouTube is to promote the show, the full fat show that you have, you kind of want the experience on YouTube to be quite faithful to the full show experience. You don't want people coming to YouTube consuming something completely different and then finding the show and being like, oh, this is not the same. So yeah, it's a really big challenge. And, you know, definitely, I mean, the broadcaster YouTube limits, you know, some are sensible, but many are really mad. And it's an area I've been working in a bit of late. You know, I've heard
an example of a mad.
I heard one and it was I think it was something like 8 times 2-minute clips for a whole season of a show.
Oh goodness, that's no use at all.
Yes, that's no use at all. And it's not helping anyone. And the other thing then that to layer on top of this, that is, I know I love getting into the weeds on YouTube, but it's the geo-blocking piece where, you know, there's requests to geo-block certain markets. And again, it's kind of hamstringing the content before it even gets out there. Because YouTube naturally or intrinsically will deprioritize anything that's geo-blocked. So it is a real challenge, you know, and I think that's a conversation I have sometimes where it's like, having those conversations. Producers tend to be very focused on getting the green light, and I totally understand that because that's what keeps the lights on in the companies that they're working in. But if you get the green light at the expense of being able to understand the YouTube promotional plan, understand the YouTube rights, understand what needs to be done at least to promote the show and what could be done to build the show beyond the show and into a brand, then, you know, that you need to have that conversation really early on. But it is hard when you're basically, you know, the advice is say no to the green light versus preserve your YouTube rights. So it is a tough one. And hopefully, I don't know, hopefully broadcasters, you know, are coming around to the need for YouTube. There's obviously lots of data out there that supports the need for YouTube in any sort of kids brand. So
I mean, even as you're talking, I'm getting annoyed. We're in September 2024 and we're still talking about broadcasters thinking that YouTube cannibalizes viewing. I mean, goodness, are we still having that conversation? Is it not yet clear that all boats rise and can rise if these platforms are embraced?
Well, to be fair, I mean, YouTube obviously has been chewing away at overall broadcast hours, you know, in the US, but I think it's about broadcasters moving on to, you know, and finding a model that works on new platforms as well as on old platforms, because the old platforms are falling away and the new platforms are here to stay. Like, as we just navel gazed into 5 years into the future at the start of the show, you know, YouTube will be, I can only assume, even more dominant in 2020 and we're talking about, so like this will be about 2030. So, but it's just that old school way of thinking that it's because it isn't, even in the short term, it's not helpful. Because even in the short term, if you're hamstringing promotion of your show on the biggest global platform for kids, you as a broadcaster aren't benefiting either.
Yeah.
And you know, there will come a point where some of the more powerful producers will then turn around and say, you're no longer a good business partner for me, Mr. Broadcaster, Mrs. Broadcaster.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of something that Seth Godin said, the marketeer, which was, I think he said, most people's problem isn't piracy, it's obscurity.
That's a good one, Andy.
Yeah. And I think that's nailed it, really.
Yeah. I mean, back to the question, which is a really great question and does hark back to our conversation with Jeff Gomez about narrative design and transmedia strategy. Given that producers, yes, are very often working with tight budgets and haven't got the luxury of having a separate YouTube production budget, again, that narrative design comes into play where you think, okay, how can I tell my story? How can I tell my story and therefore create my story that I can pull bits out of it for these other platforms? It still leaves the audience with the same kind of takeout, the same kind of feeling, and hopefully is a bit of a carrot to say, actually, you've watched this over here on TikTok or you've seen this on YouTube and it was so compelling, you want to go and consume some more content over here, hopefully broadcaster. And actually think about it in that way, in that you can tell a story across an entire ecosystem. Again, back to the need state of your viewer, serve them content on the platform where they're at, you know, in the need state that they're in at the time, and use it as a way to bounce them around an ecosystem that benefits the broadcaster, but also services the audience on YouTube, and hopefully allows the producer to produce in a cost-effective way that doesn't require extra over and above cost to produce for these platforms.
Just do that. That's fine. That's all you need to do. Yeah.
I still have Jeff Gomez's, you know, word.
No, I know, but it is true. But like, you know, and again, it's that thing of like, you also need to learn these new platforms. Just because you can make a show for traditional broadcast doesn't mean you can make a great YouTube video or a great YouTube presence or a great TikTok or whatever, or even a great trailer.
And maybe going back to the first question about where we were talking about the needs of your viewer or the audience, it's as much for the broadcasters to try and have that mind shift of not just thinking about an audience of their channel, which I know is difficult because that's kind of their reason for being, but to think about serving the audience as a whole, really, and having the channel as part of that ecosystem.
I mean, you know, I think about Risa Tisa on TikTok and how storytellers, a new generation of storytellers that have grown up in this platform agnostic way, consuming content across platforms, they're actually the ones that are best placed to think in this way with this narrative design that sits across platforms. I mean, you know, look at what she delivered. 8 hours of an epic tale
Wow.
split up into, 50, 10-minute TikToks and told in a way that very often opened with a hook and left
Mm.
the end of most episodes on a complete cliffhanger. I mean, there's no way you weren't going to watch the next episode after, watching a lot of what Risa Tisa put out. So again, a completely different way of telling stories, but also really kind of exposed this, misconception that young people's attention spans have declined, because there was a whole heck of a lot of them that watched all 8 hours.
Oh my God. Yeah.
So she's
Yeah.
on about 450 million views for the whole thing.
Wow. Crazy.
Yeah, amazing. This is it, and that like it's telling stories in these new ways and making them appropriate for the platform.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, another thing that I read that links into your point there, Joe, somebody I was reading was saying actually attention patterns haven't got shorter, but consideration patterns have massively got shorter, and that the challenge for everyone was to try and kind of be considered, rather than once they did decide to kind of to view your content, then they could give you a lot of attention. It wasn't the case that it was just 10-second attention span.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this came up on our YouTube session at Kidscreen, didn't it, Emily, with David Williams about spark, stoke, reward, and how you've got to keep delivering that loop over and over. Spark curiosity, stoke interest, reward it with a cliffhanger, a piece of drama. But actually, you could do that once in a minute, and you might have to do it 10 times over in a piece of content to maintain that interest or consideration, as you put it, Andy. But that again is what YouTubers, that's what they do instinctively. That's what they've grown up doing. And that's how, like I said, Risa Tisa, who isn't a producer or a TV maker by any stretch, managed to get people to watch 50 episodes of a pretty
streaming series.
Well, yeah, 50 episodes in 8 hours. I mean, goodness, that's some engagement.
Amazing. Well, I feel like that was a really good one of listener questions.
That was fun.
Yeah. Any feedback on the episode? If you want to run this format again, I think it was a lot of fun, and we kind of jumped all over the place, which we usually do, but I feel like we even stretched the boundaries of conversations even further on this one.
Yes.
Thank you for sending those questions in. I think we should revisit this periodically. It's nice to get the old grey matter working on different parts of the industry and different parts of the business. And maybe we should get listeners on asking the questions next time. We'll get them to send us voice notes. We can get them
that'd be great.
more involved.
A call in. Yeah, that'd be really good fun. Okay, shall I do a quick sign off?
Do it.
Yeah.
Great. So we really hope you enjoyed a special listeners' questions episode of the Kids Media Club podcast. Please leave us a review and hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. I mean, if you haven't subscribed already, what have you been doing? And yes. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thanks. Right.